Hello YouTube. Today I'm going to be talking about my playthrough of first Berserker Khazan. This is probably my favorite Souls-like that I've played, including games from Software, including all Souls and Souls-likes. I would say that Khazan for me is number one. Um, Followed closely by Liza P. I think that it was hard for me to kind of decide which one is my favorite, and I kind of had Kazan and Lies of P sort of tied for first place. But after recently replaying Lies of P, it's still an incredible game, but I think that for me, Kazan is slightly above that, very very slightly. So this is one of my favorite games that I've played in recent memory, and I recommend everyone play it. I will start off with why I like this game so much, and it's all gonna boil down to the combat. I think that Kazan has one of the best combat systems in any Souls-like I have ever played. Even though there are only three weapons, there is so much versatility within those weapons that it's just an extremely enjoyable experience. The game also doesn't punish you for sticking to a weapon. You can easily respec your points from one weapon to another, so it encourages experimentation. You can try out different abilities and different builds. Um, Another great thing about Kazan is um, the armor set bonuses. And the best way I can describe this is that this is Kazan is kind of an in between from Neo and a traditional Souls game. And what I mean by that is, you'll have a regular Souls game, Dark Souls 3, whatever, Dark Souls 1, doesn't matter. Armor in those games, maybe Dark Souls 1 is not the best example because I think armor debatably mattered the most in that game, but generally speaking, armor in FromSoft games is not really that impactful. At best, it'll give you a little bit of defense. It might give you a little bit of resistance to a certain element or blight, but generally speaking, um, more than anything, armor is, in my opinion at least, more cosmetic than anything. And then you have the other extreme side of the spectrum in Neo, whereas armor is very important in Neo, but unless you play the game like 7 times, you're really not gonna be able to play around with the potential that Neo armor can have. Because in your first playthrough of Neo, generally you're just gonna be slapping on, whatever has the highest defense and you know somewhat decent attributes. And I think Kazan strikes a very, very perfect balance between Dark Souls and Neo armor. Whereas you don't have to play Kazan 7 times to really engage with the armor and how the armor impacts your build. And armor is definitely impactful towards your build, unlike in a game like Dark Souls. And what I mean by this is that certain armor sets will buff certain abilities. So, your build can be structured basically on which skill, whatever given armor set you'll have equipped. Um, and I played around a lot with Greatsword and Dual Wield, and I tried a decent amount of different builds, and it was always fun to, just try a different playstyle. And what I love about the armor set bonuses is that they will sometimes give you a brand new skill that is only accessible towards the piece of armor. Sometimes they will buff an existing skill and give it extra attributes. Like a great example is like the Fugitive Mage armor for Greatsword. It buffs this stab attack and it basically turns into a counter. So I really, really enjoyed the armor system in Kazan. I guess my only slight complaint is that I wish you would get more early game armor sets. For the first, I would say, couple of bosses, it is kind of very Neo esque where you're just kind of putting on whatever armor has the highest defense. The other sort of slight negative is to play around with these armor sets, you might have to do a little bit of grinding. I didn't really mind that much because I love the combat in this game, so even though I farmed multiple armor sets. I want to say throughout my entire playthrough, I probably farmed 4 armor sets. If I'm going by memory, but around 4. Um, and I just didn't really mind it too much because the combat is so fun. Another great aspect of Khazan are the bosses. Even amongst my favorite Souls games, like for example Lies of P, and let's say Black Myth Wukong, even though these games are generally very, very good, there's always at least 1 to 2 bosses that are just complete garbage. And I can safely say that Kazan never really had a boss like that. Don't get me wrong, there are bosses I like more than others. There are bosses that I think are okay, but I didn't really fight a single boss in this game that I was like, wow, this is total dog shit. Um, just to, you know, give you an example, again, I love Lies of P. Lies of P is an amazing game, but Door Guardian, for example, I think is a shitty boss. Um, this might be a little more subjective. Like, I don't like the Black Rabbit Brotherhood fight in Lies of P. I think it's below average. And for Kazan, like I said, even the what I would consider the weakest boss fights in the game don't reach the lows of some of the other great Souls-likes out there. I just think it's the quality of the game is just very consistent all across the board. I'll have a few complaints that I'll talk about later, but generally speaking, um, Kazan is just extremely high quality in all aspects, in my opinion at least. The combat is incredible. Um, the bosses are amazing. The game is engaging with how you structure your build with armor and skills. And this is probably where a lot of people might disagree with me, but a lot of people complain about the levels. I have a section in a little bit, or I'll talk about the levels shortly, but I don't hate the levels in this game. I thought they were perfectly fine. Again, I fall more in line with the combat focused side of the Souls like spectrum. You'll have folks that prefer Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1, and they like creative levels that, might not be very standard. But personally, even though the levels in Kazan are not super creative, they don't make me want to pull my hair out. So, for example, you know, Dark Souls 1 has something like Crystal Cave. And yes, Crystal Cave is a unique level, but is it fun? Not really. What's another example? The Catacombs. I hate the Catacombs. I despise them. Or Tomb of the Giants. I also hate that level. So, basically, the argument that I'm making is that Khazan never really had a mission or level that I absolutely despised. Are the Khazan levels the most memorable? Probably not. I actually think Lies of P has Khazan beat, in my opinion, when it comes to the levels. But I generally had no issue with the missions in Khazan, mainly because the combat is so fun. So while the levels might not be the most creative, um, they they function as they should, in my opinion. And for me, as long as level doesn't make me hate playing the game, that's a win in my book. Like, for example, Neo 1. I like Neo 1 and Neo 2, but Neo 1 specifically has a lot of missions that um, are honestly kind of miserable to play. Like, some of Neo 1's levels are just confusing as hell and just annoying, and just Kazan never really had that for me. Um, were they a little forgettable? Sure. But overall, I thought they were most definitely above average. You can make the argument that, sure, the levels are probably the weakest part of the game, but for me, I like them. Now I'll talk about some of my complaints. Again, no matter how much I like a game, whenever I make these sort of video diaries for a playthrough I've done, I always try to talk about, some of the negatives. And I strongly believe that there is no such thing as a perfect game. While Kazan might be one of my favorite games of all time, there are still negatives. So I'll talk about some of them here. For one, farming the armor sets. So the way getting armor sets work is that you need a there's two ways to get them. They can simply just drop from the boss, or they can drop an item which is needed to craft the armor set. The annoying thing about this is that that item that you need to craft the armor set is not a guaranteed drop. And honestly, at bare minimum, and generally you're gonna prefer to craft the armor set than getting a drop. From my understanding, if I'm remembering correctly, when you craft it, you can craft the highest rarity that you have available at that time. And I believe it's going to be current level. So even though while you're farming an armor set, you might be the boss, you might get instead of a purple. I know purple is not the highest rarity, but let's just say like it's the highest at that stage of the game that you happen to be at. You might get the right armor that you need, but it might be a blue, right? So generally speaking, you're probably going to want to craft it, and it can be annoying farming a boss only for them to not drop the item that you need to craft set armor. Another thing I didn't like that much, and again, this is subjective. Um, I really wasn't a fan of the jars of the jarlings. I'm gonna call them Jinjos for anyone that's played Banjo. But they're basically this extra collectible in each level. And to be honest with you, towards the end of the game, I just looked up where they were. Uh, again, I'm just not a huge fan of them. I understand it's extra content, so I'm not going to complain too much. But uh, by collecting the Jarlings, you do have access to a very powerful helmet, which will let you get to your set bonus with lower requirements. I believe it basically counts as two towards your armor set requirement. I can't remember exactly. The whole point is towards the end of the game, I walked around with the jar on my head, basically. It's a from I could be wrong, but from my understanding, it's a pretty good piece of armor, and just you know, collecting these Jarlings can be a huge pain in the ass, especially if you don't look them up, just because, the enemies are going to respawn, and just, there was a point in the game that was just very tedious, and it was collecting those Jarlings. Another issue is also the other sort of hidden collectible, which is these red crystals that are, scattered in the levels. Just like the Darlings, there came a point where I just looked up where they were. The unfortunate part about it is that it kind of resulted in me having to go through the levels sometimes more than once, because obviously I don't want to spoil the whole level. So I will beat the level only to find out I might have missed one of either a jar or these red crystals, and then have to do the level over again. Another complaint I had was, and I'm going off of memory here, but there's basically this mission based system where you can use, I guess, like points that you get from completing these missions to buff one of three different stats. And to actually get set points, you have to like navigate through this menu to actually claim the points. So for my playthrough, I did most of the game without even knowing I had like a huge sum of points just unused. So I do wish the game had some kind of notification, or just a little bit of a better way to let you know that you have unspent skill points for this specific mechanic. I like the fact that the mechanic is there, because again, it's just more way to sort of customize your build. I just think it's again, maybe I'm just stupid, but it's kind of easy to miss. Another complaint I had is just the requirements needed to fight the basically like the ultimate version of the final boss, which is, if you don't collect all this stuff, from my understanding, you won't get to fight the last phase of the final boss. Now, I kind of will talk about later how that third phase, I'm not really that big of a fan of it, but kind of to for completion for completion purposes, I didn't want to fight the true final boss, and you have to collect basically all these notes throughout the different levels, and just like the crystals, just like the jarlings. At some point, I had to look up where these notes are and make sure I had all of them, so that I don't kind of soft lock myself out of fighting this boss, and it's just, it's just pretty tedious and just not really that fun. Another issue will stem uh, towards the enemy variety. I think at the beginning of the game, the enemy variety feels fine. You're getting to a new level, you're fighting new enemies, but unfortunately, once you start getting towards the end of the game, um, the lack of new enemies kind of starts to show. And I want to say like 75 to 80%, like once you're towards the very end, you've already seen all the enemies. And you're kind of fighting the same mobs that you've been fighting earlier on in the game. So I do wish that the game just had a few extra enemy types, because I did start to notice towards the end that, you know, towards later levels, there were not a lot of new enemies. This is a little specific, but another one of my complaints, and I believe it's either the last level or one of the last levels, had this extremely tedious, I would say arguably the one shitty level in the game that I actually think is shit. Had these like crystals on the ground, and they just, I feel like they just serve such a little purpose. You run up to them, they have like surprisingly a decent chunk of health, and then you have to run back so you don't get hit by the explosion when you destroy them. And it's just the level is full of them, and it's just tedious. It's just annoying having to clear these crystals. I really don't think that they contribute much to the game. The game would have been better off without them. And it's kind of a shame because I feel like the game was doing so good, and then it kind of, in my opinion, dropped the ball a little bit with those crystals. But it is a minor complaint, but I figured I'd mention it. Another issue as well is the it was something to do with the training mode. Now, do bear with me because I'm going off of memory. I believe that your meter, like the resource that you need to use your special skills, does not refill in training mode. So let's say you've spec'd into a skill, you want to see how much damage it does. You have to hit the dummy to get the meter to use the skill. And I just like, surely they could have put in the game a way to just make your meter capped so you can more easily test out how much damage your skills are doing. Maybe this is something they added later. I know that they added a couple of stuff, but at least when I played the game, this was not in the game, so that was a little bit annoying. Normally, for these types of Souls videos, I will talk about all of the bosses. I did it with, pretty sure I did it with Wukong. I don't think I talked about every single boss in Wukong, but I talked about every boss in Demon Souls, for example. But I am not going to talk about every boss in Khazan because for a lot of them, I'm basically just going to say, yeah, this boss is pretty good. So I'm going to talk about specific bosses that come to mind that I have certain things to say about. So I'll talk about some of my least favorite ones and some of my most favorite ones. But do keep in mind that I will talk about every boss in the game. So I'll start with my least favorite bosses, which ironically happen to be mostly the female humanoid bosses. So I'll start with, I believe is Elamine, which is the girl with the shield. Again, I don't think this is a bad boss, but she is a little bit annoying. I do understand that Elamine does promote playing aggressively. You want to hit her when she's nearly out of stamina so you can do damage. But it is just not as satisfying to fight her because, a lot of the times you're just hitting her shield. So, again, I think in the grand scheme of things, Elamine is a great boss, but it is one of my lesser favorite bosses in the game. I will also talk about Belerian, which is another female humanoid boss, which is this elf mage girl. I actually had to farm this boss to get the fugitive mage set for the greatsword, and yeah, this boss is a little bit annoying. Um, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what annoys me, but she's just not the most fun to fight. She runs away quite a bit. She summons this ghoul that you have to basically get rid of before you can hit her again. And for me, the most annoying part about her is when she puts the shield around her, and you have to break the shield. Again, I think in the grand scheme of things, I think the boss is great. I mean, it certainly smokes other mage bosses in other Souls games. It might not be super fair, but like you look at something like Crystal Sage in Dark Souls 3, and I like Dark Souls 3, and like Beleriand completely destroys that boss out of the water. You look at something like Fool's Idol in Demon Souls, Beleriand also smokes that boss out of the water. So in terms of mage bosses in Souls likes, Beleriand is amongst the best. But when looking at all the bosses in Khazan, it is one of my least favorite ones to fight. Um, Another sort of honorable mention is uh, Traka, which is the other mage girl, the water mage girl. Now, I don't think this one is that bad, but it is kind of the same issue I have with Beleriand. She does a lot of running away, um, and she's just, again, not my favorite. I still think it's a good boss, but amongst Khazan, it is like, I would say, bottom four, bottom three, bottom four. And the last boss that I really wasn't a big fan of was Hismar, which is the big dragon. Again, I said it in my Wukong video. Um, it's hard for these types of games to get these like giant cinematic bosses right. Um, Most of them, in my opinion, are just horrible to play. Like Fire Giant is a great example. I know I've talked about Fire Giant before. I absolutely despise this boss. You have something like the Great Chingadang and Wukong, which is also a shit boss. Um, you know, Dark Souls 3 has like what the Elder Wyvern I think is what it's called, which is kind of more of a puzzle boss. But the point I'm making is, you know, these sort of giant bosses, in my opinion, have always been a miss. Um, in these types of games, like even in Dark Souls 2, you'll have like the Iron King, where you fight like in that platform with the lava. Even though you only see, half of him because the lower half is submerged, he's still, a giant dragon. So the point still stands. Like usually these cinematic giant fights are just not really particularly fun for me. I would say that prior to Hismar, Midir was probably like close to the gold standard on how to make these like not horrible. But I do think Hismar is better than Midir. So I don't want to talk too much smack about Hismar. I mean, again, he is one of my least favorite bosses in Kazan, but in the grand scheme of things, I think Hismar is easily the best, if not close to the best, giant fights in this type of game. Probably the most frustrating part about Hismar is just hitting his head. Um, Similar to Midir because he's just so enormous. Whenever he is not sort of in like recovery frames after doing an attack, it's pretty difficult to hit his head, and that's where you're going to be doing any significant damage to him. Now I will talk about my favorite bosses in the game. I do think that the first big roadblock for a lot of players is Viper, and I think Viper is actually a pretty good boss. Obviously, at the beginning, I got stuck on this guy for a very long time, but I still was sort of getting accustomed to the game. But I do think that Viper is a lot of fun to fight. More notably, his first form. It is very satisfying to sort of perfect block his combo strings. And I think he's a great knowledge check to sort of teach players about the game. So I do think Viper is a pretty good boss. Um, Maybe people disagree with me. I think Rankus is a decent boss. He is also pretty satisfying to block his strings. But I will say, out of the bosses that I do like, Rankus is probably going to be towards the bottom. But I do think, I did want to mention him because once you sort of solve this fight, he is pretty fun to fight. Then I'll talk about Maluka. I think this is one of the best boss, if not the best boss in the game. I am gonna give Maluka the best boss award for Kazan. This boss is so fun. Um, when you first get in there, you get completely destroyed. The fight feels almost impossible, but The learning process from getting completely cooked to mastering the boss is so rewarding. And the boss is just like one of the most fun fights in any Souls game, in my opinion. So I think Maluka is one of the greats, like one of the greatest bosses this genre has seen, in my opinion. And yeah, definitely one of the highlights of the game. I do also want to talk about Shakuka, which also has this variant called the completed Yerid, or Yerid the completed. I actually do like this boss, but more notably, I want to talk about the other variant, which is the harder version, the Yerid the completed. I did like this boss a lot. It was a really like high octane, exciting fight. I will say this game did really good with the boss runbacks. So boss runbacks are basically non-existent. But for whatever reason, Year the completed makes you like go down an elevator, which can be a little annoying. Again, relative to other boss runbacks in other Souls games, like this is like a dream. But I do kind of wish that they would have just put the bonfire right outside the boss door. Like, why make me take this elevator? Um, but regardless, ignoring that fact, Yerda completed, I think, is a great boss. He's a lot of fun to fight. He has these weird, like, janky looking combos, and I think he's one of the harder bosses in the game. And I'm sure at the beginning he's going to completely wreck you. But once you, again, kind of like Maluka, once you kind of solve the boss, I think this is a great boss. Lastly, I'll talk about Scalpel, which is, I think, another great boss in the game. Unfortunately, while I do think Scalpel is a lot of fun to fight, he does inflict, I believe, poison or some form of poison on you, which is kind of a shame, just because these types of statuses for bosses are always a pain in the ass. But I do think that Scalpel's moveset is a lot of fun to learn, and he's just a fun fight to do. Again, it's kind of brought down, in my opinion, a little bit because of the poison, but I am going to give Scalpel, like, I think he's like top three best bosses in the game, in my opinion. And just like Maluka, you run in there, he completely wrecks you, and it's kind of cool to like finally kind of solve it, only to realize he has that second phase, and it's like this is impossible. But I had to farm Scalpel for one of the armor sets for the dual wield, and I feel like I got pretty decent at the fight. And again, I didn't really mind farming this boss just because I do think it's a really fun fight. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the final boss in the game because it's kind of not controversial, but I mean it's like one of the harder bosses in this type of game in general. It is a three-phase boss fight. I actually do think that Ozma is a good boss. I just think that personally, I would like this boss better if it was just two phases. Like the third phase is like not necessary in my opinion, and it's just more stressful than anything. But I do think phase one and phase two are actually a lot of fun. So I will say that Ozma in general is a good fight, but three phases is a little too much. Like Sister Freed is also a three-phase boss fight in Dark Souls 3, but the individual stages of that boss are way easier in my opinion than Ozma. Like I think Ozma is like pretty hard across all three phases in my opinion, and just the fact that you have to get through all three of these is kind of nuts. But I guess that I'm not gonna complain. I mean, it is cool having this sort of difficult final boss. Too often, you'll have final bosses for Souls games just be complete shit. Like, look no further than like Dark Souls 2. I mean, both Aldia and Nashandra are fucking garbage. Um, so I think it's refreshing to see like a nice proper final boss. I should have mentioned it earlier when I talked about the gameplay, but there's one aspect of the gameplay that I do want to mention, and it's like this. I forgot what it's called, but it's like this special counter. The best way I can describe it is like like in Lies of P, certain enemies and bosses will have this like attack where the enemy model will like turn red, and the only way to block that attack is with a perfect block. Khazan has something kind of like that, but it's like this different type of block. It's like a different input. And at the beginning of the game, I hated this. I absolutely hated it, just because I didn't have the muscle memory for it. But the more I played the game, once you build that muscle memory, that special block, not only is it a great opening to actually do damage to the boss, but I actually really like this mechanic of having just like this additional layer to the combat. In this case, a different type of block for certain attacks. So I just wanted to mention that because I really like that aspect of the combat. Lastly, I'll talk about my experience with the two weapons that I used. I did use the spear a little bit, but I only used it in a couple of missions, so I'm not going to talk about the spear because, frankly, I don't know enough about it to really even have an opinion on it. And again, this is just like my experience with greatsword and dual wield. This is not like a meta opinion. Again, I'm just a casual player, so please, like I could be wrong in some of the things I say. So this is just going by, you know, my feel when playing through the game. So I'll talk about the dual wield first. I think the dual wield is extremely powerful. Down to some of the passives that it gets. One of its passives gives you like this super roll, basically like it like doubles the, not doubles, but it gives you like this extended roll. I think it's totally broken. Um, and then I didn't use this for most of the game, but dual wield has this like almost like this Shoryuken, this like uppercut, whirly blade attack, and it's absolutely nuts. It does an absolutely crazy amount of damage. And one thing I didn't mention with the gameplay, like whenever you deplete a boss's like posture or stamina, whatever you want to call it, you can basically just wail on them until you either do the finisher or they just like recover and go back to normal. And when you break a boss's stamina, you can do an absolute monster amount of damage by just cycling through this move. It's extremely powerful. Another skill I wanted to talk about with the dual wield is like this like freaking anime looking Naruto like nothing personal kid attack that has like it almost acts like a counter. Like if you do it at the right time, you can basically tank. I think pretty much any move in the game. I believe I ended up using this a lot when fighting Hismar, the giant dragon. And I think this ability is just absolutely crazy. It's insanely powerful. Just a couple other notable like dual wield abilities. You do have sort of like this single sort of swipe after a perfect block, which is really nice. So if you're blocking like a boss's sort of combo strings, you can sometimes get like a one little cheeky auto attack or one cheeky attack after getting a perfect block. I also when I farmed Rankus because he had an armor set bonus. If I remember correctly, like his armor set buffs this like charge attack. This is the one attack that, admittedly, like I had a hard time wrapping my head around how it worked. But I did use it for a little bit, and it did do a ton of damage. So I didn't want to mention it. But I'm not sure if it's like meta, if it's like amazing. But it did the job for me. So, lastly, I'm trying to think if there's any dual wield abilities that I missed. There's this like I don't want to call it a dash, but it's like it moves you forward. And once you level up to max, you can get I believe up to 3 charges of it. I do like that ability as well quite a bit. So I did want to mention that one. But overall, I do think that dual wield is extremely powerful. I actually think all 3 weapons are extremely powerful. I'm not really sure what the weakest weapon is. But I would be surprised if it's a dual wield. I think the dual wield could be a contender for one of the best weapons in the game. I would say, like, if I had to guess, I would say maybe Greatsword is the weakest, but even then I could be wrong. But you really can't go wrong with dual wield. I think it's a lot of fun to use. And yeah, it's just an incredible weapon, and it's very flexible. And yeah, I had a lot of fun using it. Lastly, I'll talk about the Greatsword. I do think the Greatsword is a ton of fun. It basically has this, once you spec into it, if you get a perfect block, you basically do this like quick double swing, and they can actually be followed up by a third ability, which is what the Fugitive Mage armor buffs, and it basically turns a third sort of stabbing attack into like a counter. I thought that was a crap ton of fun. I love that aspect of the Greatsword, like that specific Fugitive Mage build. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier on in the video, why I like the combat so much, why I like the armor sets, but buffing certain abilities. Another notable thing about the Greatsword is this like counter, which I think I actually really like this move because I do think it's a very skill expression based sort of move. You have to use it at the right time. And I feel like if someone like actually mastered a given boss fight and how to use this move, they can absolutely go crazy using this at the right time. I think I could be wrong. I think it has the potential to be like extremely powerful, if not overpowered. But what I like about it is that it does requires mastery to use effectively. Another move we'll talk about, the Greatsword, is exclusive to, I believe, the armor set that Maluka drops, or craftable by the item that Maluka drops, and it gives you this like 5 or 6 hit combo. It does a honestly a disgusting amount of damage. It does cost a lot of like meter to use, but when you have an opening, the damage it does is nuts. So that move is also very powerful. Greatsword also has this sort of I don't want to say, I mean, I guess it's kind of like a combo, but if you spec into it after you do a running attack, and then you do a charged heavy, you basically like charge to max level really fast. It kind of reminds me a little bit, actually, for anyone that's played Monster Hunter, of Valor Stance and Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate for Greatsword. Whereas once you entered Valor Stance in that game, you can basically get to like level 3 or level 4 charge like really, really fast. So I really like that element of Greatsword as well. Um, when used properly, you can get like maximum charge attack very, very quickly. And I remember I farmed the Hismar set, the Hismar armor, and I believe his armor lets you go to it lets you access like an extra level of charge. So getting to use that was a lot of fun. I believe I used that towards one of the later game bosses. I'll try to put some footage while I'm editing the video, but that was also a ton of fun. So that's what I mean. Like, there's so many ways to play. Like, there's not just one way to play Greatsword. There's so many different ways to use it. So even though the game only has 3 weapons, within those weapons, there's multiple different play styles for those weapons. So that's why I just think that the combat in general and the builds and just everything about the combat, in my opinion, is amazing. So just to wrap up my thoughts on this game, again, I think it's one of my favorite games. I think of all time, honestly. Like if I had to make a list of like top 10 favorite games of all time, I would definitely put Kazan in there. Certainly think it's the best Souls game that is out right now. Beating anything FromSoft has put out themselves. I know people might disagree with me. It is subjective, but that's just my opinion. Um, I think that Kazan is really going to be the gold standard when it comes to making engaging, fun, and flexible um, combat systems in Souls games. And it's like once you've played Kazan, it's kind of crazy to go back to just like a Souls game. Where you know you're basically just rolling and maybe doing a couple of R1s. You do the occasional R2, and Kazan, you just have so many options. It's just crazy, and I feel like a lot of the options are powerful. It's not even like I'm sure that there's like a meta build or a meta strategy when it comes to speedrunning or maybe like time attacking. But when it comes to just like casual play, just playing through the game, after trying so many builds myself, uh, they all felt good, and I feel like every build that I tried could easily be used to get through the game. Um, so I really liked that aspect of Kazan, and just again being able to like freely respec your skill points and just like again I was switching between dual wield and greatsword throughout the game. Um, if I had a wish, I just wish the game maybe had like a fourth weapon or hell even a fifth, just because the weapons are so fun to use. I do really hope that the studio makes a Kazan 2 or just another Souls-like because, if it's anything like this game, it's going to be amazing. And again, just quickly summarizing, amazing bosses. I would say, again, people might be mad at me, people might disagree with me. I think pretty decent levels, a perfect blend between Neo, which requires, friggin' 500 hours of playtime to actually get to engage with the armor sets and the set bonuses in that game, to like Dark Souls, which has no armor set bonuses, and the armor is, let's be real, almost irrelevant. I think Kazan has like the most perfect blend of all those systems packaged into one game. Like even though I love Lies of P, like Lies of P doesn't have set bonuses, you know, and Lies of P has a more sort of restrictive move set similar to like a Souls game, and it's crazy that I'm calling it that, but like when you look at just the amount of options that you have in Kazan and you compare it to like every other Souls like, it's like yeah, those all the every other game just feels restricted compared to Kazan, just because the amount of variety and options that you have available to you to tackle the game is just astounding. So that alone, I think, is what for me puts Kazan a little bit over Lies of P. But I strongly recommend anyone to play this game. If anything, I actually would recommend to not start with this game because I feel like this game is so good that if like Kazan is one of your first Souls likes, whenever you go play any other Souls, you're gonna be like, damn, the combat is like I have so little options compared to what I had in Kazan. So again, if I had to give the optimal order, I would say play Kazan like as one of your last Souls games, so you can kind of, go from a more limited combat to like the freedom that Kazan provides. And yeah, if I had to give this game a rating, I mean, I know I said earlier that there's no perfect game, but um, for me, like a 10 is close to perfect, and I will give Kazan a 10. I think it's one of the greatest games of all time. I know I'm kind of glazing this game, but again, it's just my opinion. Um, it's an absolute masterpiece, and I strongly recommend anyone that is into Souls games to play it.